Welcome back. Video number 2. Let's move on, get through this chapter. So, from the perspective of wages, benefits, and pay, Equal Pay Act is something that we all should be familiar with. Fair Labor Standards Act and Family and Medical Leave Act, right? We've heard of FMLA before. But the Equal Pay Act was really interesting, right? It was put in place to make sure that women are treated with dignity and respect in the workplace and are paid for equal work. So if they're doing equal work, they should have equal pay from the perspective of their role, and it should not have anything to do with gender. So that's why it was put in place back in 1963. I would say we still have a little ways to go with this, but from that perspective, there is a Equal Pay Act that we all should be aware of from healthcare side of things, and of course from the employment side of things. Labor standards and leave. So let's talk a little bit about FMLA. Back in 1993, it gives people the option to use unpaid leave for a serious health condition, right? And we hear about this a lot of times too with, people that need to go on leave for an extended period. Maybe they had a terrible diagnosis or they have a family member that needs help. So unpaid leave for a serious health condition of an employee or a member of their family for up to 12 weeks, and your job is protected. The Fair Labor Standards Act, of course, establishes a minimum wage. We've heard about minimum wage. What is minimum wage? There's been kind of a debate about this back and forth, how high it should be, and then it mandates extra pay for overtime work. So those are all standards that are in place for employment. Workers' comp, right? So if you're injured on the job, of course, you should be compensated for that, and you should be able to get health care from the perspective of occupational medicine. And it's a mandatory insurance program for employers to employ people to make sure that people are taken care of on the job. Social Security, I'm sure you're aware of that as well, but it provides the public retirement benefits when they work and disability benefits for serious issues that come up. Medicare and Medicaid, government payers, right? It's a federal health insurance program, Medicare is, for people over 65. Or people that have Social Security disability or kidney failure. So Medicare, of course, people age into Medicare, and Medicare is, I think, a great thing for our community at large. Medicare, the population continues to grow, so that's a high debate, especially in Congress and places like that. How do we continue to afford to pay for Medicare? Because it is so costly and people are aging up into it. And then also people are living longer as well. So that's something to keep in mind too. Medicaid is different, right? It's a program administered by the federal and state governments that provide health insurance for low-income individuals. So people who are struggling to meet ends so they can apply for Medicaid, and actually get service. So know the difference. And I just actually mixed it up in my words there. But Medicaid is for those that are low income, and Medicare is for those, of course, with these three pieces here, but the main or the majority of people on Medicare are those over 65. Medicaid, right? We just went through an expansion. So Medicaid expansion happened about 5 or 6 years ago, and that included the ability for states to provide more Medicaid services or more Medicaid funding for those who needed health insurance. So when a patient comes into the hospital, right, we want to make sure they're signed up for either Medicare, Medicaid, or insurance payer, just to make sure they get the coverage they need and deserve. But also from the perspective of making sure the hospital gets reimbursed for the care they deliver. And we were running into a situation quite often where patients would not have any health insurance. And the majority of the times they were eligible for Medicaid. So Medicaid expansion helped get those people on Medicaid and help provide additional coverage where needed. So I think that was a great thing to do. It helped hospitals stay open because we had a lot of hospital closures. It was really good for small community hospitals. But that's digressing a little bit. All right, moving on. The Employment Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, protects and regulates pensions, right? We're not going to go into this, but we are going to go into HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. A lot of people confuse this. They say HIPPA, and that's not right. It's HIPAA. So now that you know that, you're an expert. You're not going to write it the wrong way anymore. But I see that quite often, so keep that in the back of your head. So HIPAA protects people from the perspective of health insurance coverage or anything else, right? We've talked about it. You probably read about it. So it's saying pretty much the summary of HIPAA is do not release information to those that are not involved in a patient's care. Do not release information to those that shouldn't know about the situation, and make sure we respect the dignity of others. And also, from that perspective, make sure that people's rights are protected and their information is not in the public domain where it should not be. So HIPAA is very, very important from the perspective of healthcare organizations. They are held to account for this. If you have a HIPAA violation, an employee can be held accountable and the organization can be held accountable, right? Because we've talked about what that law is, right? Let the master answer. There's a Latin term called res, and I'm going to have to look it up real quick so I don't pronounce it wrong. 1 second. Immediate superior, vicarious liability, right? That's what it is. So I had to look that up really quickly. And that's not wrong, right? A lot of you are not going to remember every little detail about this chapter, but looking up things is it's a good thing. You just want to know where to go, right? So the Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, sets rules and regulations up for healthcare organizations, or any organizations for that matter, to make sure that they have a safe workplace. So OSHA regulates the workplace and enforces standards through inspection and investigation. So know about OSHA, what it has to do with from the perspective of protecting others. Right to know, right? We could talk a little bit about this, read over it, but it talks about material safety data sheets, things on that nature. So if you're dealing with chemicals, as an example, employees have a right to know the dangers, and they have a right to know where to go for information for their safety. Correct? I agree. Bloodborne pathogens are another thing that comes up, especially from the perspective of OSHA and healthcare organizations. So we talk about universal precautions. This came up quite a bit in COVID, right? So making sure we had enough for our employees, especially nurses and those dealing with COVID more often, to make sure that they were safe. So a list of all job applications where employees have occupational exposure, right? So if a nurse goes in to a treatment room and they're going to have exposure to a disease, we want to make sure that they're aware of that before putting them in a situation that might be dangerous to their health personally. Working conditions, job descriptions, these are requirements as well. When you apply to a job, you usually get a job description. You have an overview of the working conditions. It tells you exactly what you have to do. Here's an example of that. You have to be able to carry a 10-pound object from A to B. That oftentimes is in the working conditions as a part of the job description. So you understand what you're getting into, and you also understand from the perspective of the challenge it might bring you physically. So there are differences from that regard when you apply for jobs, and you're probably going to see that somewhere in the application process. There are procedure manuals, right? We have policies and procedures in healthcare settings that help protect us, so we're aware of what to do in an event where there might be a challenge or an unknown. So policies and procedures help set standards for organizations to follow. Employee handbooks, hit and miss whether or not you have these. Large organizations usually do, but employee handbook usually has what your work hours are, what your benefits are, evaluation procedures, dress codes, how you act, what their expectations of you are as an employee of that organization, right? Kind of moving on from the knowledge check, you can take a look at this, but it's a true or false questions, or true or false question. Union and healthcare workers. So people join unions for a lot of different reasons, but it's really most of the time because they're dissatisfied with something in their job. So when you organize, it's a group of people that are able to come together to negotiate with the healthcare entity or the entity that you work for and have more leverage or bargaining power to work in good faith. So, one employee going up against a large organization usually is not going to get you very far, right? If you organize, you have a larger group of people and usually union workers that can help you identify how to go about doing things, and it also helps with bargaining power. All right, this is a discussion activity and a case for discussion. You can look at this and then a self-assessment. So in summary, we've talked about a lot of different things, but you can read over this as well from the summary of what we talked about. The government's influence, right, in medicine, how controlled substances impact us, and healthcare providers, basic workforce discrimination and harassment laws. We talked a lot about it. OSHA, we talked about laws that impact employee wages and benefits, We talked about job descriptions, procedure manuals, employee handbooks, unions. There's a lot of things that we discussed in this chapter. So make sure you look over this and look over these self-assessments as well, and then discussions. So we're not going to do that here in this video because we've taken up 25 minutes already, but I'm sure that you're going to get a lot out of it. You take a look at it yourself. From the perspective of Chapter 2, there's a lot in here. There's a lot you can learn, but I hope that you enjoyed it. I'm going to upload the PowerPoint as well so you have access to that. And I'm here for any questions that you might have. Reach out anytime, call, text, email, whatever works best for you. And I look forward to our next lecture together and looking forward to learning a little bit more about applied law and ethics because it's so important, right? I think you're going to really understand more as time goes on about the impact law and ethics has in our careers. And I think overall, right, the more you know, the safer you are. Again, reach out if you have any questions. Thanks so much.